The sky had no color that morning. It was not gray, not blue, not even white, just the pale exhaustion of a land too long without rain. The earth, sun-bitten and brittle, cracked beneath every hoof and step. Dust drifted in the air like old prayers, unsaid but still hanging. A ribbon of road sliced through the emptiness, its path stitched loosely between saltbush and broken fence posts. There was no sound save the wind, which made no effort to whisper. It simply moved, relentless and dry, stirring up the scent of rusted iron and dead mesquite. Along this road came a man and a horse. The man walked. The horse limped. The man, Harlan, was lean in the way trees grow after fire, stripped, crooked, still standing. He wore a coat heavy with time and road grit, the kind of coat made not for style, but for survival. His hat was pulled low, the brim weathered into a tilt that shadowed his face like a half-closed eye. What little skin showed was hard and wind-worn. His boots were near the end of their purpose. The left one flapped slightly with each step. The horse beside him was piebald and sway-backed, its eyes cloudy with age. A good beast once, maybe great, but now just another remnant. They walked without hurry, without destination. The saddle carried only a bedroll, a pan, and a small sack of oats, tied off like an afterthought. There was no rifle, no badge, no hint of intention. Harlan paused at the edge of a ridge and looked down at the town below. Bellwether lay in a low fold of land, cradled between two dry washes that hadn't seen running water in 3 seasons. It was a sad place, 5 or 6 buildings squatting under the weight of a false prosperity. The church steeple leaned slightly east, like it had grown tired of uprightness. A general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, a jailhouse with a crooked door. One street, one well. Harlan didn't flinch at the sight. He didn't smile either. He just blinked once, slow, and moved on. The sun climbed, uninvited and unkind. By the time he reached the outskirts of Bellwether, townsfolk had begun the routines, the slow rituals of survival disguised as commerce. A man swept dirt off his porch with a broom older than his children. A woman in a sun-bleached bonnet hung linens that would dry too fast and stiffen in the heat. Flies circled the mouths of dogs asleep in the shade. Everything moved in a hush, the kind born not from peace, but from resignation. Harlan tied the horse to a split rail beside the well. The old mare drank without lifting her eyes. He walked to the general store but didn't enter, standing instead under the awning's narrow shadow. He lit a cigarette and didn't inhale, just let the smoke curl around his jaw like memory. That's when it happened. A scream, not loud, not sharp, but raw. Then the sound of footsteps, many and fast. Then a thud. He turned his head slowly. Out in the street, where dust swallowed detail, something chaotic unfolded. A small figure bolted from behind the general store, a girl no older than 15, barefoot and thin as kindling. A loaf of bread pressed against her chest like a lifeline. Behind her came 3 men, bellies full and boots heavy. Townfolk gathered like crows. She didn't get far. One of the men, a grocer, Harlan guessed, grabbed her by the hair and dragged her backward. Another caught the bread mid-fall, more concerned for it than for her. Someone shouted, "Thievin' rat!" A slap rang out like gunfire. Dust rose, and the crowd swelled. The girl struggled, kicked, then cried. Not words, just noise, a sound from the pit of a belly no one had ever filled. Harlan didn't move, not at first. He watched the scene as if it were a distant fire, too far to feel but close enough to understand. The girl's arm twisted at a wrong angle. Blood trickled from her scalp. Still, she held her jaw clenched, her eyes dry. Pride or fear, it didn't matter which. She stopped crying. That's when he moved. He dropped the cigarette, stepped off the porch, walked forward. No one noticed until he was among them. Not until his shadow fell across the girl's face did the crowd hush. He didn't speak. He didn't look at the men. His boots stopped inches from the girl's outstretched leg. She looked up, unsure whether he was another hand come to strike. Harlan knelt. He slid one arm under her knees, the other behind her shoulders. She was light, lighter than she should have been, bruised in too many places. She gasped once, but not out of fear. Surprise, maybe, or disbelief. He stood. The crowd recoiled as one, as if he'd drawn a weapon instead of a child. "She stole from me," the grocer hissed. Harlan didn't respond. He turned and walked. Through the crowd, down the street, past the well where his horse still drank. The girl rested in his arms like a secret. Heads turned. Murmurs buzzed like wasps. The sheriff stepped out from his office, young, round, too soft in the eyes. "Mister," he said, hand brushing the butt of his holster, "that girl's a criminal." Harlan didn't stop walking. "Where you think you're going?" Still no answer. The sheriff didn't follow. Harlan passed the blacksmith's forge, then the last house, then the tree line, and no one stopped him. Some said later they were too shocked. Others said they were too afraid. But maybe it was something else. Maybe they saw what Harlan had seen, a world so starved of kindness, even stolen bread was sacred. He didn't speak for hours. Carried her until his arms ached, but didn't let her down. When they finally stopped, beneath a stand of junipers near a dry creek bed, he laid her on the earth, careful, like setting down glass. She watched him with a wary stare, lips cracked, hair stuck to her cheeks with dried blood and sweat. He broke the silence only once. "You got a name?" She blinked, then looked away. That was answer enough. He didn't press. He just turned to the horse, loosened the saddle cinch, and began the slow, quiet work of making camp. The wind blew through the trees above, gentle now. Less like warning, more like something close to forgiveness. The fire was made small, not for lack of wood, but out of instinct. A low flame, barely a whisper against the night, just enough to keep the cold from settling too deep into their bones. Harlan sat with his back against a fallen trunk, legs stretched long, eyes half shut. The girl slept a few feet away, curled in a blanket he had taken from the saddle roll, her back to him. She had not said a word, not when he cleaned the blood from her temple, using water scooped from a rusted tin pot, not when he offered a piece of hard biscuit softened in broth, not even when she shivered and he laid his coat across her shoulders. Silence wrapped around her like a second skin, fierce, taut, and unreadable. Harlan didn't force anything. He'd known silence himself, known it in jail cells, on battlefields, in the long stretch of prairie nights where the stars looked down like old regrets. Sometimes silence was armor. Sometimes it was all a person had left. He let her keep it. An owl called from somewhere beyond the trees. The sound rolled low and patient across the darkness. The fire cracked softly. In the spaces between, Harlan could hear her breathing, tight, uneven, but steady. She wasn't asleep. Not really. She was listening. He tilted his hat forward and watched the flames through half-lidded eyes, letting them dance in the glossy reflection of his memory. Morning came slow. It always did in the woods, where the sun had to thread its way through the canopy of pine and cottonwood. The fire was long dead, leaving only the smoky scent of ash and charcoal. Harlan stood before dawn, moved like someone used to doing, without sleep. He walked down to the creek bed, mostly stone and dust now, but there was still a trickle beneath the surface in places if you knew where to dig. He knelt, pushed away the dry grit, and coaxed water into a tin cup. Clear, cold, barely enough to taste. Still, it was something. By the time he returned to camp, the girl was sitting up, not looking at him, just sitting, legs pulled to her chest, arms around her knees. Her face had the look of someone waiting for the second blow. Harlan set the tin down beside her, sat a few feet off, began to tear a piece of dried meat with his teeth. "You got a fever?" he asked finally, not expecting an answer. She glanced at the cup, then at him. Still didn't speak. "You keep that quiet up, birds'll think we're ghosts," he said. She blinked once, her fingers tightened around her legs. Harlan exhaled through his nose and looked away, toward the trees. The branches moved like old hands, beckoning nothing. After a long while, she reached for the water. She drank in 3 gulps, then wiped her mouth with the back of her wrist. He saw her eyes then, if only for a flicker. Green, but dulled by something older than years. She glanced at the coat still around her shoulders. "You can keep it," he said. She said nothing. He stood, packed his bedroll, loaded the pan and tin cup into the saddlebags. The piebald horse watched him without interest, its ears twitching against flies. The day was already warming, sunlight slanting golden through the trees, lighting flecks of dust like motes in a cathedral. He offered her a strip of jerky. She hesitated, then took it. Progress? They walked. She did not ask where? He did not say. Sometimes the land led the way better than any map. Harlan picked trails that wound through shade past the dry skeletons of cattle that had never made it to water. Each step away from Bellwether was a thread cut, a silence deeper than the one before. He watched her out the corner of his eye when he could. She walked barefoot still, though slower now, her feet blistered and raw. He offered to stop, to rest. She shook her head. That afternoon, they came across an old cabin half collapsed into itself, leaning like a drunkard against a hill of sand and sage. Inside, they found a chair, a broken pitcher, and a floor littered with feathers and rat bones. The girl sat without waiting to be told. Her breathing was ragged, but she didn't complain. She didn't even wince when she peeled a splinter from her heel with the tip of a rusted nail. Harlan set about boiling creek water over a rekindled fire. "You run from someplace?" he asked. She looked at him, then back at the floor. He nodded, as if she'd spoken. "I did too." Evening fell. Long shadows spilled across the plains like spilled ink. Crickets began to chirp, their chorus soft and strange in the loneliness. Harlan dozed, his hat over his eyes, until he heard a soft rustling. She was near the fire again, hunched close, feeding it with dry grass and chips of pine bark. He watched her silently. She stood then, moved slowly toward the piebald, who stood tethered beneath a half-dead tree. The horse turned its head slightly, snorted once. She placed a hand gently against its neck, then pressed her cheek against the old animal's hide. She didn't cry, just stood there, eyes closed. It was the first time she let herself be still. Harlan looked away, not out of politeness, but reverence. Some things shouldn't be witnessed too directly. Later, they sat across from each other in the glow of firelight. He passed her a warm piece of cornbread, the last from his rations. She ate slowly, with care, like it was a thing that could vanish if handled wrong. When she finished, she looked up. "My name's Etta," she said. The words hung in the air like smoke. Harlan gave a small nod. He did not smile, but his eyes did something close. "You got people, Etta?" She shook her head once. "No more." Then, after a pause, "You?" He considered. "Had 'em." The fire cracked between them. A breeze moved through the ruined cabin, bringing with it the smell of dust and ghostwood. Neither spoke again that night. But something passed between them, not trust, not yet, but something quieter, an agreement, a shape taking form in the silence, shaped not by words but by the way he passed her water first, or the way she stirred the fire without being asked. A rhythm, fragile and real. In the dead of night, coyotes howled in the distance. Etta stirred but did not wake. Harlan sat awake beside the dying embers. The girl curled under his coat, her breath steady. His eyes scanned the dark horizon, the thin silver line where the land met the moonlit sky. Somewhere behind them, Bellwether still spun its little cruelties. Somewhere ahead, more towns waited with more laws and the same hard eyes. But in this moment here, there was only fire, wind, and two broken creatures who had nothing, but chose not to be alone. The trees thickened as they moved north, the open land giving way to stands of ponderosa and pinon pine. Sunlight filtered through needles in long, dappled beams, and the wind sang differently here, softer, laced with the scent of sap and wet earth. The land no longer crackled underfoot. It breathed. Etta walked beside the piebald now, boots 2 sizes too large tied around her ankles with rawhide string, Harlan's old pair worn down to the welt. She still limped on the right foot, where a scab split beneath the pressure of each step, but she didn't complain. Her silence had changed shape. Less armored now, more attentive. She watched everything, leaves shivering in wind, a woodpecker tracing the same line on a tree, the cloud shadow that passed like a slow animal overhead. Harlan walked ahead, one hand on the horse's reins, the other swinging with each measured stride. He spoke little, but when he did, it was simple things. "Birch bark burns quick," he said once, crouching to strip a sheet from a tree. "Good in wet." Or, "If you smell sulfur in a spring, don't drink." Or, "Deer'll bed down your creek beds come dusk." These small facts hung in the air between them like stepping stones. Etta remembered each one, not because she thought she needed to, but because they were pieces of him. And there weren't many. They made camp near a dry stream with just enough water left in a rock hollow to boil rice and soak 2 crusts of bread. Harlan collected wood, moving through the trees like a creature that had once been part of them. Etta watched him move. He never broke branches. He bent them, never stepped on dry twigs, always over. "You ever trap?" she asked, her voice startling them both. Harlan didn't turn around. "Once." "You still do." He paused, one hand resting against a trunk. "No need to now." Etta looked down at her hands resting in her lap. They were scabbed and raw from the days of walking, from gathering wood and carrying the water pot. They didn't look like a child's hands anymore. "You afraid of anything?" she asked. This time Harlan did turn. His eyes, pale and unreadable, held hers for a long moment. Then he shook his head, not as answer, but as dismissal. He dropped the wood by the fire pit and knelt to strike the flint. Flames caught quickly. "I ain't afraid of dying," she said, "but I get afraid of hunger." Harlan didn't speak, just laid the heavier branches over the fire, adjusting them with the slow care of someone who knew how easily things could go wrong. After a while he said, "Hunger don't leave marks you can see, but it hollows things." Etta nodded, though he wasn't looking. Days passed. They never returned to a town. Instead, they wandered, up hills where old miners had once dug for copper, down through valleys where wild horses left their prints in dust. They caught rain in canvas, boiled roots neither could name, and took shelter in what was left behind by people long gone, old trappers' sheds, cabins with chimney stones still blackened. Etta found a crow's feather one morning and tied it to her wrist with string. Harlan didn't ask why, but he saw the way she touched it when she thought no one was watching. One night, as firelight flickered against the base of a rock face, Etta began to braid rope from thin strips of bark. "I seen my ma do this once," she said, "before she went. Hands always busy." Harlan nodded. "That's how you keep your mind straight." She worked in silence for a time. Then, "You ever love someone?" The question came like a stone dropped in still water. Harlan didn't flinch, just stirred the embers with a stick, eyes lowered. "Thought I did." "What happened?" "She left." Etta tilted her head. "Why?" Harlan gave a small shrug. "Same reason everyone leaves?" That was all he said. She didn't ask more. She felt the edge of his silence now. Not a wall, but a wound. On the 4th day in the forest, they found the ruins of a homestead. Just a rectangle of stone and collapsed timbers, overgrown with sage and moss. A rusted stove stood crooked in the center, its door hanging open like a mouth mid-sentence. On the edge of the ruins, a small graveyard, 3 wooden crosses, faded gray. No names. Etta sat beside one of the graves and ran her fingers across the cracked wood. Why'd they always use wood, she asked. Because it was all they had. She thought about that, thought about how even memory had to make do. Inside what had once been the house, Harlan found a steel mirror hung on a nail, too scratched to see through. He offered it to Etta. She held it a moment, then set it down gently beside the cross. They don't need to see themselves now. Harlan looked at her. He didn't say it, but something in his face softened. That evening a storm rolled in, slow at first, then loud, cracking like ribs beneath the pressure of something bigger than breath. Rain fell hard and fast, drenching their camp and putting out the fire before they could cover it. Harlan dragged their packs under a rock overhang, pulled Etta close beside him. They sat shoulder to shoulder, shivering. Etta's head leaned against his arm without asking, her body trembling, teeth clicking. Harlan draped his coat over her, then pulled it around both of them. His hands didn't touch her, not directly, but the heat of him was there. "I used to think storms were God," she whispered. "Breaking the world in half." Harlan's voice came low, steady. "Maybe he is." Then quieter still. "But maybe he's just angry no one's listening." They waited until the storm passed. When the sky opened again, it was clear. Stars blinked down like distant campfires. The forest dripped and steamed in the returning silence. Etta turned to him then, studying the lines in his face, the way the stubble caught moonlight. "You're not like the others," she said. "Doesn't take much," he replied. "No." Her voice firmed. "It does." She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a piece of bread, molded at the edges but still whole. She held it out. "For you." Harlan looked at it, then at her. He took it in both hands, not out of hunger, but like it was a thing carved out of memory. He didn't eat it. He just held it and let the moment settle. They didn't speak again that night, but in the quiet something shifted. Not loud, not sudden, just the slow reweaving of two lives, frayed too early, the way tree roots wrap around old stone, not fast, not neat, but certain. The forest thinned as they moved eastward, trading green hush for brittle scrub and golden grass. Hills rose and fell like old shoulders, too tired to stand straight. The sun came down harder now, unfiltered by pine, and the air took on the taste of copper and dust. Where trees once muffled sound, now the world lay open, wind dragging across dry land like a blade against bone. Harlan knew the silence here, knew what came after it. Etta didn't speak much, but her eyes were sharper. She watched the horizon more than she used to. At night, she slept closer to the fire, her fingers curled around the crow feather still tied at her wrist. She asked fewer questions, as if she'd learned the land would only give what it wanted, and no more. They followed the curve of a river gone shallow, its bed lined with smooth stones like forgotten teeth. Every now and then they'd pass a fence long since broken, posts slumped, wire hanging like the remains of a failed promise. It wasn't long before they saw cattle again. Thin, slow-moving things, their ribs pressing through hide like knots under canvas. No one branded them anymore. No one claimed them. But someone was watching. It happened 2 days south of Willow Ridge, near a dry gulch where the wind never stopped moaning. Harlan had stopped to water the horse. Etta stood on a flat rock, arms out, trying to catch the wind like it was something she could hold. That's when the sound reached them. A distant creak, wood on wood, slow and deliberate. Harlan turned, his hand instinctively falling to his belt, where there was no gun. A man sat on horseback at the top of the rise. Behind him 3 more. Clean shirts, clean boots, coats without dust. They looked like they didn't belong to the land, but to something above it. The first man wore a black vest and carried a Bible strapped to his saddle. His beard was neatly trimmed, and his hat looked like it had never touched rain. He raised a hand in greeting. "Evenin'," he called, voice sharp as a crow's call. "Didn't mean to sneak up." Harlan said nothing, just waited. The man smiled, slow and dry. "Name's Lyle Marston, preacher by trade, shepherd of souls. You might say I wander these parts looking for lost sheep." Etta stepped down from the rock, standing close behind Harlan now, not touching, but near. "You from Bellwether?" Lyle asked. "News rides slow, but it rides sure." Harlan tilted his head slightly, a gesture somewhere between yes and no. Lyle clicked his tongue. "They say a girl was taken, that she stole, that the man who carried her off was known once by other names, names that came with bounties." He let the silence stretch. Harlan didn't answer, just waited. The preacher's eyes narrowed, ever so slightly. "Not here to judge, that's for God, but law follows close behind his shadow, mister. And the folks I ride with, They got long memories and longer reach. Behind him, one of the riders shifted, hand brushing the stock of a rifle. Harlan's jaw twitched once. "You want something?" Lyle's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Just want to be sure the girl ain't being led into more ruin than she came from. Sometimes a thief's better off behind bars than in the woods with a man who don't speak." Etta stepped forward before Harlan could respond. Her voice was steady. "I'm not his prisoner." Lyle blinked. She took another step. "He took me from worse." The preacher studied her like she was something under glass. "Child, it's not about what you want. It's about what's right." "What's right," she said, "is food when you're starving and quiet when the world won't shut up." Lyle frowned. "You've got a mouth on you." Etta didn't blink. "You've got a book you don't read." The preacher's smile vanished. Harlan shifted his weight, subtly, like a wolf adjusting in tall grass. "We done?" Lyle looked past them, toward the setting sun, where birds moved in dark clouds against the gold. "You got no claim to her? No papers, no name worth protecting." "Then leave us be," Harlan said. Lyle studied him long, too long. Then he leaned on the saddle horn and exhaled. "We all answer in the end." And with that, he turned his horse and rode off. The other men followed, their silence louder than threats. Dust lifted behind them like smoke from a dying fire. That night they made camp in a grove of juniper far from the trail. Etta didn't speak for a long time. She sat beside the fire, turning her hands in the light like they belonged to someone else. "They'll come back," she said finally. Harlan nodded. "Most things do." She looked at him. "Why didn't you run?" He tossed another stick into the flames. "Because I don't." Silence. "Then, if they kill you?" He shrugged. "Then they do." Etta chewed her lip. "You think it was wrong, taking me?" He stared at the fire a while before answering. "I think there's a kind of wrong that fixes other wrongs." She looked at him long, the firelight painting soft gold along the curve of her cheek. "I don't want to go back," she whispered. "You won't." The words were simple, but she heard the promise under them, the kind that doesn't need to be sworn. She moved closer to him then, sitting so their shoulders touched. The wind pressed through the trees above, tugging at leaves like fingers pulling thread. Somewhere in the dark, a wolf howled, not near, not far. The next morning, they found a trail carved through the brush, boot prints, horse tracks, ashes from a fire still warm. "They were close," Harlan said. Etta knelt beside the prints. "They'll follow." He looked around. The land ahead sloped into canyons, wild, twisted places where maps meant nothing and sound couldn't find you. "You ready for that?" he asked. Etta stood. "I was born in corners." They spent the day crossing rock beds and climbing ridges that cut the sky like knives. No paths, just instinct. At the top of one bluff, Etta looked back. Below them, open land spread like an old wound. No riders, no smoke, no sign of the men in clean coats and holy words. "You ever kill anyone?" she asked. Harlan didn't answer right away. "When I had to." "Will you again?" "If I have to," she nodded. "Then I'll stay close." He looked at her then, not as a child, not even as a girl, just a figure standing in the sun, unbowed. She met his gaze without flinching. "I won't be taken, not again." "I know," he said. They made camp near a cliff edge that night, stars spread wide and low above them. The fire was small, shielded by rock. Harlan worked a snare for rabbits. Etta stitched a tear in her sleeve with a bent needle and thread made from horsehair. No one spoke of the preacher. No one spoke of law or names or the line that might one day be crossed. They just sat in the hush that only danger allows, the quiet between the next thing. When the moon rose, it caught Etta's face as she lay back against the saddle, her eyes still open. "You think we're wicked?" she asked. Harlan looked at her. The light drew a pale arc across his cheekbone. "No," he said. "I think we're just tired," she smiled. "Not wide, just enough." The hills grew softer in the days that followed, losing their teeth. Pines gave way to cottonwoods. Grass, golden and whispering, waved low in the wind. The world seemed to breathe out after holding too long. Even the sun lost some of its sharpness. They traveled slower now, not from fear, but because there was no need to hurry. The preacher and his men had not returned. Either they'd lost the trail, or they'd decided the girl wasn't worth the trouble. Or perhaps they'd learned to fear the silence that followed Harlan like a second shadow. Whatever the reason, the land gave them space. They settled on a ridge above a dry valley, where a broken windmill leaned against a slanted barn. Below it, a stone house half swallowed by grass and time. It was empty. No signs of fire, no bones, just stillness. The kind that lives in places forgotten so long, even ghosts grow quiet. Harlan dismounted and walked the perimeter, slow and deliberate. Etta followed, not asking if they'd stay. She already knew. Inside the house, dust lay thick over the hearth. A bird's nest clung to the rafters. On the floor, a small iron pan, rusted through, sat beside a jar of nails and a wooden spoon worn down to a nub. Harlan knelt, picked up the spoon, turned it over in his hand like a relic. "This'll do," he said. Etta smiled without smiling. They spent the first day clearing the place out. Dust turned their hands gray. Cobwebs clung to their faces and arms like old sorrow. Etta scrubbed the stone walls with water from a nearby spring. Harlan patched holes in the roof with cedar bark and strips of canvas. The windmill, coaxed back to life with oil and patience, began to creak again. It was not a home, but it was shelter. At night, they sat in the open doorway, looking out over the land. Coyotes called. Crickets hummed. The moon lay swollen and low over the hills like a watchful eye, refusing to close. "Feels like we're outside the world," Etta said. Harlan nodded. "That's the only way to live in it." They didn't speak much, but they worked. Each morning brought the same rhythm: gather wood, mend fence, carry water. Etta planted seeds from a sack left behind by whoever had lived there before, a mix of beans, wild onion, and something with purple flowers she didn't recognize. Harlan built a windbreak for the old mare who had grown slower, but still followed him with the devotion of something too loyal to give up. There were no clocks, no calendars, only sun, shadow, and memory. Sometimes Etta would walk to the ridge alone, stand there, arms crossed, eyes on the wide horizon, not searching, just remembering what it felt like to be chased, and what it meant not to be anymore. One morning, Harlan returned from the creek with a rabbit in one hand and a letter in the other. It was folded and tucked under a stone at the edge of the spring. No markings, no name. But the handwriting was careful, too careful to be casual. Etta opened it while he watched. Her fingers moved slow. Inside, 2 lines. "The Lord sees what men forget. The Lamb remembers." She folded it again without speaking. Harlan didn't ask how it made her feel. She didn't need to say. He tossed the rabbit into the pan, salted it, and waited for the fat to hiss. They ate in silence. The windmill creaked in rhythm. The world went on. Autumn leaned closer. Nights came colder now, and Harlan brought down extra pine boughs to line the walls. Etta stitched a second blanket from old sacks, her fingers more skilled now, her hands steadier. She spoke less these days, but her silence was different. Not guarded, not afraid, just content. One evening, she brought him something wrapped in cloth. He unwrapped it slowly. Inside, a small loaf of bread, dense and brown, still warm from the fire. She looked at him, her expression unreadable. "I remembered." Harlan turned it over in his hands, the weight of it heavier than it should have been, not from flour, but from meaning. He said nothing, just tore it in half, offered her one piece. They ate with their backs to the fire, watching the sun bleed its last color into the grass. Later that night, she fell asleep on the porch, arms crossed beneath her head, curled beside the horse who dozed near the fence. Harlan sat nearby, knife in hand, carving nothing in particular into a piece of driftwood. His eyes drifted to the horizon. Where once danger had come like smoke over a ridge, now there was only space, wide, open, and indifferent. The preacher had not returned, And maybe he never would, or maybe he already had, and decided they weren't the story worth telling. That was fine. Some stories were meant to be buried under the dirt and left to bloom wild. Near midnight the wind shifted, a cooler breath carrying the scent of distant snow. Harlan stood, stretched his back, and looked down at Etta. Her face, bathed in moonlight, looked older now, not in years, but in shape, in silence, in the way people grow when no one's watching. He laid a blanket over her, careful not to wake her, sat down again beside the fire, his coat drawn close. His knife rested in the dirt, forgotten. The coals glowed dimly, painting the stones in slow orange pulses. In the distance, a lone wolf called out, not near, not far, and not for them, just the land remembering itself. At dawn, the valley was painted gold. Fog clung low to the ground, and everything was quiet, as if the world had paused to listen. Etta stepped outside, barefoot, arms crossed, eyes on the sun. She said nothing, just stood beside Harlan, shoulder to shoulder, their shadows long and still. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the crow feather, now tied to a piece of twine, held it out to her. She took it slowly, fingers brushing his, then turned and tied it to the porch post. A marker, maybe, a totem, or just a quiet way of saying, "We were here." They stood like that for a long time, watching the wind move through the grass, bending it, but never breaking it. No future spoken, no past explained. Only two figures framed against the wide silence of the west.